Everyone, Dr. V, and this is the latest episode of Better Humans at Work. I'm thrilled to be joined by Thamara Subramanian, who is a equity audit and strategy manager for the Winters Group. And I'm just super excited to nerd out over DEI data with you today.
Me too. I'm so excited. Thank you so much for having me here. Really excited to get this conversation started.
Yeah. So before we get into the work that you do, can you talk a little bit about your background and your role at the Winters Group?
Awesome. Yeah, for sure. So I was born and raised in Kansas City, moved a bit around the Midwest and East Coast, and now back in Kansas City. And my passion and kind of what brought me to this work was started in public health. So I did a lot of social justice education and public health education work. Everything from eating disorder prevention to diabetes education, things like that. And that really exposed me to so many root causes of systemic injustice, especially social determinants of health. And then once I went to graduate school to get my master's in public health, I became more in tune with health equity and just social inequities in our world. And that kind of helped me transition into this space of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So currently, right now, I work and have been working at the Winters Group, which is a Black-owned diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice consulting firm, where we help our clients, so clients across nonprofit, for-profit, a variety of industries, help actualize equity and justice at their organizations and get that systemic work done. So my primary role right now with the Winters Group is the Equity Audit and Strategy Manager. So I am in charge of the process of doing organizational equity audits, which are essentially mixed methods assessments with organizations to unpack the root causes of injustice, kind of see where their strengths are in regards to DEI, see what weaknesses there may be, and what we can do to bridge that gap. So my team, along with Kevin Carter, who's our Vice President of Strategy and Assessments, we put together comprehensive data, recommendations, and guide and partner with our clients to create a sustainable strategy for their organization to really embed diversity, equity, inclusion work and have it be less of a side thing and more of a this is a part of our organization.
Yes, I always say, to do this work right, it really needs to be embedded into the fabric of the overall organization, especially when it comes to equity work. And so here at Mattingly, I always say we're the eye of DEI. So we really focus on the inclusion piece and trying to bring more scientific rigor to how inclusion is defined and operationalized and measured. And so it sounds like the Winters Group has a really strong emphasis on the E, the equity part of DEI. And so what does that look like in practice? Like, what is equity data? Like, how do y'all define equity? Like, how do you help your organizations be more equitable and socially just?
Yeah. So we like to say that we take a justice-centered approach to our data and assessments. And so what we mean by that is we look at really three big questions. Because I think sometimes when people think of the word justice, they think of like the law or like justice is served or like being in a courtroom. But what we're really trying to do is make justice something that is part of your everyday life. So when we are looking at data, looking at your organization's practices and policies, we are asking first, who is benefiting from what is offered at the organization? Who are those groups? I think sometimes we often think, well, everyone's benefiting from the offerings at our organization, the health benefits, the employee resource groups, the learning, the development. But at the end of the day, we've realized through talking to employees and talking to leaders that some groups are disproportionately being benefiting more. Some groups are actually being harmed. And that's our second question. Who's being harmed, either inadvertently or not, by policies, practices, and systems in place? And then lastly, how can we shift and redistribute power. I think power is oftentimes that silent, understood word in DEI, DEIB, DEIJ, whatever you call it. And we don't talk about it as much, but many of the inequities that exist are because of power differentials and not being able to spread that in a way that's equitable. So we look at those three questions: who is benefiting, who is harmed, and how can we redistribute power to make things more equitable. And we define equity as being able to have equal opportunity or the ability to thrive regardless of your social demographics. Oftentimes I think, and I was thinking about this earlier as we were talking to some clients about equity, but some people think that if someone starts at a place of disadvantage, they have to give away something to then create equity. But I kind of see it as we're trying to push everyone towards having the most or being able to thrive or getting what they want. So that's kind of how we define it. And the way we approach our data is very mixed methods. And what we've realized is that's the only way or the most effective way to actually find facts that create change. So what we mean by that is, like, oftentimes you'll just see numerical data or representation data. A lot of times when people talk about DEI data, they're just talking about the D. And I'm sure you've noticed that in your work too. Like, just a lot of representation, a lot of, oh, we have this many people of color, this many women, or this many LGBTQ folks. But that doesn't really do much long term. Of course, representation is important. But if you're not able to retain, if you're not able to innovate, if you're not able to sustain as an organization and make people feel included and also give people those opportunities, so that equity piece, the work ends up becoming just inauthentic or performative per se.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just really hits the nail on the head with, the DEI data. The organizations really tend to focus on those demographics and that representation, which is an important piece of the puzzle, especially going back to your definition of equity. You have to be able to identify what those subgroups are to then assess if different people are benefiting and being harmed and, having access, and to be able to learn how to redistribute that power. But that's only one piece of the picture. And so I wanted to get into, like, what are the common types of DEI data that organizations should be collecting? So we know they do collect some demographics, but what else should they be collecting?
That's such a great question, because I think organizations should be collecting a lot of different things, but also keeping in mind what is practical and accessible as well. So we're noticing that typically organizations collect some type of HR data, but even if they do collect it, there are many times where that data is gatekept. For example, we could work with organizations and they may have HR data or EEO style data, but even their analysts don't have access to that due to legal or compliance reasons. But I think in terms of what people should be collecting, it looks a lot like robust information on employee and leader experiences. And what I mean by that is getting interviews, listening sessions, or focus groups of qualitative data. And really, qualitative data helps us with those communities most impacted. So when we're thinking about justice, who's being harmed and who's benefited, it's really hard to tell who's being harmed and benefited through just the boxes that EEO data puts people in. For example, as an Asian American, there's many, many different countries in Asia with many subcultures. There's also many disparities in socioeconomic status, for example, of those different countries across America. But if we put us all in a category called Asian, it's really hard to tell what specific group in that group is facing certain struggles. And many of these groups may be facing struggles, but they look different. And with interviews and focus groups and that qualitative data, you're able to more unpack what is that difference. Like, oh, maybe we're seeing that people of color are leaving an organization more than white folks. The why is why we need to have data that is qualitative.
Yes.
And so at the Winters Group, what we've been thinking about is not just what data we should be collecting, so definitely that qualitative and quantitative piece, but also how we're analyzing that data. So not just summarizing key themes, for example, oftentimes obviously very useful to get like recommendations, but also trying to parse out cultural patterns. So we do something that's called a dominant culture analysis, where we're looking at 6 different themes, such as concentration of power, right to comfort or fear of open conflict, individualism, perfectionism, things like that. And seeing how not just, oh, people say we have a perfectionist culture, but even how people talk. So, for example, if people are explaining their culture as like fast paced, like we don't really think through things that much and we just kind of go through it, and almost like drinking water by a fire hydrant or fire hose or whatever that analogy is, that's an example of like a probably excess sense of urgency.
Yeah.
And the thing about these dominant culture patterns is that they affect everyone at the organization, and they disproportionately affect marginalized communities. So in our society, that would include historically women, LGBTQIA folks, people of color, people of low socioeconomic status, folks with disabilities, and so on and so forth. So really looking at not just what people are saying, but how they're explaining their culture is something we found super important and really useful data to really address how can we change our culture. Because oftentimes when I know in your work looking at inclusion is part like woven into something you can weave into culture, and it's so intertwined per se.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we too take a mixed method approach with our inclusion work. And so we do a workforce survey that we then learn, what groups feel like they belong the least at the organization. And then we do those targeted focus groups to find out the why. I always say the quantitative often tells you what's going on, but the qualitative then tells you why it's happening and what those potential solutions can be. So yeah, very similar approaches, but different lenses that we're looking through. And I love that dominant cultural perspective. I think that's really wise to have that framework to be able to, look at the cultural piece and what could be done about it. So we know organizations should be collecting quantitative and qualitative data to understand all those different components. What barriers do organizations typically encounter when getting started with their DEI data collection process?
Well, I would say there's barriers across every aspect of this work, everything from the interpersonal level. So just even gathering or trying to do this work requires an amount of alignment from your leadership and from people who are making those big decisions at the organization. We've often found in our work that without leadership buy-in or leadership interest and passion to do this, any sort of DEI data strategy or analysis effort falls short. Because you can collect as much data as you want, you can report as much data as you want, but if you're not going to do anything about it, what's the point?
Exactly.
So that's one barrier. I would say second is the one I kind of talked about earlier, which is just red tape, and that varies across organizations. So even like many organizations like even don't even collect data by demographics. For whatever reason. And sometimes some organizations have holes in their data, or with turnover, mergers, acquisitions, things like that. The data is kind of messy, at least the quantitative data, in a way that's really hard to decipher what's going on. So oftentimes the work that we do is kind of coming in and collecting that data to give them a baseline to start with. And that can be really hard for leaders, analysts, people in the DI space to hear, because I'm sure people have been doing so much of this work to whatever capacity over years, and then feeling that they're starting from square one can feel uncomfortable or frustrating per se.
Yeah.
And
oh, go ahead.
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's hard. I've had a few clients where they've had their DEI leader and programming in place, but they didn't have that buy-in to collect that baseline data, and so the baseline data isn't truly baseline because they've already been doing efforts. And I always say a snapshot is better than no snapshot at all, and there's always opportunity for improvement. And to do this right, you need to be continually remeasuring and seeing how things are changing and that progress. But there's a lot of fear around collecting the data, especially from executives. And have you found any strategies to kind of help executives overcome that fear and that reluctance to collect data?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because like a few years ago, I remember distinctively a client who asked us or came to us to inquire about these audit processes. And then we shared, we share this data, and a big part of it is we don't just send a report out like a piece of paper that you can put in your desk, but we try to do a presentation with all the leaders, executives at the organization, and people responsible for DEI work to share this data. And then we work with organizations to help them find a way to transparently share this data with everyone who's involved. But then we had a client that was like, wait, I don't really want to do this, because once we have that data, then we have to like actually do something about it and share it. And that is not a uncommon thing we run into. It's not an uncommon thought. But it really comes to show, and going back to dominant culture patterns like power hoarding and concentration of power. A lot of people think, oh, if we have the numbers, that's what we need. We'll do something about it. But that is just the start. Yeah. But often seeing that barrier. And what has helped us with this is we found out, like, just going into an organization, getting their data doesn't really work. And even from an employee perspective, if an organization has that culture of, I don't really trust my leaders, or I'm scared to talk, we can't even get that qualitative data. People don't want to sign up to join a listening group or a focus group. So something that we have done in our approach is integrated learning and kind of sessions in between our data analysis and collection process. So we usually start our data and audit process with an alignment session, which is where we meet with leaders and those in charge of the DEI initiatives at the organizations to get on the same page of why we're here, what we're doing, and how you as a leader can be an advocate for this work internally. Oftentimes we work with these clients then to just get on the same page of what does success look like. So why are we doing this work, and tying it into their mission and vision for the organization. Because we work with so many different types of industries, sometimes it's really easy to connect DEI, equity, and justice to an organization's mission if, for example, they're a nonprofit or they're doing social work. But if you are, for example, a large tech company or a manufacturer, for example, or we work with some utilities companies, it can be really hard to see that connect. So we try to do these alignment sessions and education sessions to truly get to the point of, here's why we're doing what we're doing, and we hope that you can then advocate and be able to speak about this to employees. So when we do send out invitations to be a part of collecting data, people actually want to and are not going to be like, I don't want to say anything, because they're not going to do anything about it. So it's a way of holding leaders accountable. And then another thing we do is also doing learning interspersed to understand DEI concepts and understanding like a new definition of data. So really trying to shift not only, like, I know your work and my work, we're doing a lot of mixed methods work, but typically data has been so quantitative. in these spaces. So really getting clients to also at the same time open their minds about what data is and not just the numbers, so that when we do see the data, when we do share those findings, people can come with it with the right presence, the right open-mindedness to actually do something about it, instead of seeing a bunch of employee feedback, for example, that may be negative and being defensive, which can backtrack the work.
How have you, in your work at the Winters Group, like overcome some of the backlash that happens whenever DEI initiatives are underway, especially from majority group members and those who typically don't see themselves as part of DEI efforts?
It's a great question because it's always a work in progress. And I think, there's not a perfect solution, but really being able to have more touch points with everyone at the organization. So as I was saying, these kind of integrated learnings, being able to, our client success team, like really wants to meet with our client contact and anyone from board leaders, execs who maybe feel skeptical or just want more information or want to feel heard. Oftentimes, having those one-on-one conversations with people are also super important, because the reality is many organizations, leaders may not feel safe sharing those questions in these group education sessions or alignment sessions. And so we try to, I wouldn't say like nip things in the bud as they come, but really try to take that meeting people where they are approach to make sure that we always have a critical mass of advocates, a critical mass of people motivated and inspired to do this work. And since our sociopolitical climate is so everywhere, things change so often. And oftentimes we're seeing people leave organizations. We're seeing people like all sorts of different things, and that always changes dynamics. So being really in tune with those changes. Sometimes organizations forget that, for example, if you're like merging with a new organization, that's a big change, and that's a part of this work, and not seeing that separate. If you're getting a new CEO, or your board is shifting to new people, those are big changes that impact this. And so looking at all those things and being consultants from an even macro lens and being in tune with what's going on. So we often work with healthcare organizations, and depending on healthcare policies, funding changes, things like that, those all impact people's presence to do this work. So I guess our approach is really just keeping in tune with what's going on, not just within the DEI space of the organization, but beyond that, to help them see that this work is not just one part of the organization, but part of all of those things. And that usually helps people bring people along, and really just pausing, I would say. So anytime there's like an issue arising or a resistant person, instead of just ignoring that one resistant person, we would try to work with them, have a conversation, and see what we can do. At the same time, the balance of one naysayer does not mean that we should halt the work.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes clients feel like that we're seeing less of that from my perspective, at least, but sometimes people want to halt the work for one loud voice in the minority. So making sure that doesn't happen is something we try to do as well.
Well, it truly is a change management exercise. And
Absolutely.
I think taking that approach to the why of collecting the data and, the what's next, because that's such a pivotal part, is then what do we do with the data? But, as you said, keeping in mind, all the things that are happening at the organization, it truly is a robust change management effort. And to use the data collection as part of that change management, I think about one of our clients, and it's in the service industry, and we're building them a code of conduct. And part of that was a data collection effort to learn, what are the most important behaviors that we need to keep in mind when building this code of conduct. And someone made a comment like, oh, it would have been great if the code of conduct was out already because we have a big festival coming up. And I was like, but people are thinking about these concepts, right? Just the fact that this survey went out and it's asking questions about behaviors and inappropriate behaviors and what we need to focus on, like it's part of the intervention itself. But being able to manage all those pieces around it is so critical, as you said. And something else that I thought of when you were chatting was the Dolly Chugg in her book, The Person You Mean to Be. She talks about how there's this split of like, there's DEI like champions, and then there's DEI detractors. But then there's this whole movable middle, and really focusing on that middle rather than the detractors, and just making sure that the champions have louder voices. So the movable middle skews more towards that champion side and doesn't skew towards that detractor side. And so I love what you said about meeting people where they're at, having those conversations, but also not letting those detractors halt efforts as well.
For sure. And like the thing about the middle is really making sure that everyone, no matter what their role is at the organization, like can find a connection to this work. And it's not just, oh, you have to be on a DEI team. Like everyone from finance, analytics, marketing, product, there is ways to be equitable and inclusive and just in what you do. And like making those connections for people, we have found is super effective, because then they're like, oh yeah, like this is actually really important to me and my role at the organization, and not just to society. And yes, to society is important too, but to get that larger change in the change management, being able to connect it to people's jobs and how they do their work has been really powerful. And the qualitative data and being able to look at policies and practices with the justice lens as well has been really beneficial in doing that, because people are able to see, oh, this is really directly related to me and my role. And it also gives people the opportunity to reflect on how can this be related to my role if they haven't had that opportunity before, or if didn't have to think about it, which also moves people along.
Yeah, I love that. I forget who did the initiative, but it was called Inclusion Starts with I, right? And so really helping people understand what their individual role is with advancing DEI, and how we all have, an important part to play, because that's what culture change is. It's how people behave, and it's how, people run their day to day. And so, having that onus of responsibility, I feel like is super important. For those watching out there that want to take a more data-driven approach to their DEI efforts, what are 3 ways that you would recommend, really integrating more data into doing DEI work?
I would say the first thing would be to start looking at what you have already. So intersectional variables. You may already, I feel like most people these days do have some access to some data, or even just opening your mind to what that data is. It doesn't have to be HR data. It could just be things that you have done at the organization. And then looking at a little bit deeper, who came to these events, for example, if you were doing learning for DEI, who came to these events? What kind of people came to these events? And we often hear from clients survey fatigue. We've given employee feedback before when nothing has happened. Pausing for a second and looking at what employee feedback that you have that you may not have looked at. A great example of this would be exit interview surveys. Many organizations do some sort of exit interview, and that data just kind of gets put in a folder and isn't really looked at. Sometimes people will look at the quantitative part of it, but not really looking at what people are saying. Even just starting there, I think sometimes people feel like you have to do this full haul and use a lot of resources to get data into your work. But looking at that exit interview data and seeing what patterns am I seeing, what are people saying, and who's saying it. are, for example, women having a different experience or reason why they're leaving. We had this happen with a client a few years ago where they were looking at patient exit interview data from their hospital. And the reason they came to us was because they had some pretty strong complaints from folks of the LGBTQ and transgender community about how they were being treated by staff and professionals at the hospital or the clinic. And they hadn't really taken a deep dive on those like little exit interviews or patient feedback bucket, where you put the thing in the little shoebox. And once we looked at that, we realized like a lot of it came down to the initial interaction with nurses on using gender pronouns. And this is not something that they could have found out through looking at HR data or looking at patient compliance, because many of these healthcare systems don't collect gender pronoun data. It's not part of the system yet. Some are, and I think that's changing. But this was like a huge aha moment for them. And then they realized, okay, we should probably then get some training for our healthcare professionals on what inclusive gender pronoun usage looks like and how to interact with people. And that made a huge difference for them. And it was just a piece of data that they had that they didn't really know that they had. You just had to look at it. So I guess my advice is to just look at what you have in a different way, in a more just way, thinking about who is saying this and why, and also giving that value the same amount of value as the numbers that we have out there. Oftentimes we don't get HR data that's as strong or a stronger case, but really looking at those other pieces and really valuing what employees are saying. Because that is something we notice even when we do listening sessions and interviews. People are like, I've done these before. I've done focus groups, and I just don't know if what we're saying is actually acted upon. And that becomes a big discrepancy. So that, and then being able to then communicate that data and that you're doing something with it, like any small wins you have across the organization. We're just noticing more and more transparency and telling employees good or bad news is important. And many times organizations are trying to maybe hide data that's not so great, or maybe things that came up that aren't so great for the sake of protecting the organization. But people are seeing through that. People aren't stupid.
Earlier you mentioned in your first recommendation, like utilizing the data you already have on hand, especially intersectional data. For those watching out there, how do you find intersectional data? What did you mean by that?
So what I mean by intersectional is looking at more than just one social demographic. So for example, we tend to look at race specific data or gender specific data. What would it look like to look at race and gender together? So if you're getting a statistic that people of color are leaving this organization at X amount of rate than white people, what would it look like to say, but women of color are leaving at this rate and men of color are leaving at a different rate? What would it look like to say, like, LGBTQ folks who are people of color have an even disproportionate rate of whatever? And being able to parse that out can be really powerful for people as well. So that I've noticed that it's more powerful for people with dominant identities, such as white women and white men, because they're able to see, or for example, I had one time a white male veteran really appreciate that we parsed out veteran status, because he was like, that is a part of my identity that people don't really think about. And it was a way for him to connect to the experiences of other marginalized groups and the data we were sharing. But yeah, people's identities are so complex. And the more we can get information on those intersections,
Yeah.
the more meaningful it can be for people. And sometimes we get pushback because maybe there's only one or two people of Native or Pacific Island identity at your organization. And oftentimes, if you're just doing a traditional statistical analysis, that's a very small sample size and you just can't do much with that. So being able to actually have a interview with this person can really highlight and amplify the voice of people. And that's a big part of the justice lens as well. Like being able to get data on groups that often are silenced in numbers.
Yes.
And I'm sure you experience a lot of that as well in measuring inclusion.
Yeah. And that's a big part of our work, is amplifying voices that typically are silenced, and bringing light to those various experiences, especially whenever those sample sizes are small, those n sizes are small. But how can we make sure that we elevate those voices to then be the foundation of change? Thamara, I could talk all day with you about DEI and data, but we are coming to a close. How do people reach out to you if they want to connect and learn more about the work that you do?
Absolutely. We at the Winters Group love meeting new people, new organizations, and anyone we want to collaborate and partner with. We do a combination of this audit, equity audit work I talk about, as well as speaking engagements, learning journeys, all with a equity and justice framework, everything from cultural competence onwards. And you can reach out by either you can message me on LinkedIn or at the wintersgroup.com website. There's an inquiry form that you can fill out to get to know many of the other awesome people on my team as well. So, yeah, those are some ways to get connected. We're also on Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook. So many different ways to plug in. And our team actually wrote a book called Racial Justice at Work that came out this February, which has practical solutions to actualizing this work at your workplace across those various different organizational functions that we talked about. So everything from HR to philanthropy to data. So I have a few chapters in there, and so do my colleagues. And so if people want to learn more or love to read a book like I do, that is an option as well, which you can buy through any site.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for all that you do to help us be better humans at work.
Thanks, Victoria.